Welcome to Rethinking Youth Ministry, where each week we hope to raise the bar for youth ministry by asking questions, interviewing thinkers, and having real, honest conversations about what it looks like to lead the next generation. I'm Sarah, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Crystal.
Hey there.
Chef.
Hey, everybody.
And Jamie.
What's up, guys?
And today on Rethinking Youth Ministry, we're going to discuss the question, how do you lead students of the opposite gender? And what should you keep in mind when leading students of the opposite gender? So, who wants to dive in first?
Well, I'm so glad we're talking about this.
Yes.
Because when we speak, particularly to women in youth ministry around the country, it's one of the questions we get is, how do you lead the guys in your ministry? Because as women, we get that question all the time. And I don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't as men in youth ministry. Do you? Do people ask you, how are you going to lead girls? Or is that just something that we get asked?
I get asked occasionally, but it's far more the other way around.
Yeah.
I think traditionally it is the male in front. So, which is not necessarily a good thing, but so when a woman gets up, it's interesting to me because when we would have female speakers, this was probably 10, 13 years ago, 15 years ago, I really pushed to have female speakers, and I would get that question about what about the boys? Will they pay attention? All those sorts of things. And it was never the boys who complained.
That's interesting.
It was girls who complained about, and women small group leaders who complained about, and that may be a whole nother topic, but that was usually where the tension came from, and the boys were always like, no, it was great. You know?
Yeah, well, that's a whole other topic, because the women in the room know what's at stake when a woman gets on stage, and we're like, hit a home run, girl.
Yeah, do not stink. You can't do that. Everyone's watching.
Yeah.
I do think there are so many layers to this. You could back up really far, but one of the things for like the female leaders listening to this right now, one of the things you definitely need to do right from the start is realize your context. And are you in a context that actually affirms women in leadership and women on the stage and women speaking? Because if not, then, I mean, you've got a whole different set of ways to honor your authorities, but yet fight for the ministry that God's called you to in that context than those of us, or those of you, who are in churches and contexts that, recognize that women can lead and speak up there with men.
Well, it seems like, so there's a couple of different ways to look at this. We're talking about someone on a stage speaking and kind of leading from the stage, but also some church context, you could potentially have a leader of an opposite gender of a small group, right? I mean, is that, that's another layer of complications, I would think.
Yeah.
So,
I've served in ministries where we had co-ed small groups, and that was always a tension to manage of, does this really serve everybody in the group? Do you then need two leaders in the group? Does the group ever split? And sometimes those groups went really well, if I'm being honest. And sometimes they went really, really badly.
So what would be the reasoning behind doing that? To me, it seems like it would be natural to have same gender leaders with same gender kids. So what would be why would you not have that? Is it
manpower?
Manpower? Yeah.
Manpower, just the amount of kids. Although I feel like if you've got two, then you can have a small group with a leader, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's important. This is an interesting, because I automatically went to, after a certain age, you need to be in separate gender groups. And I think it might be a window that may open and then close back again. Like, I feel like the older people get, the more this can happen. And what broke me of that was I went to a week-long conference called Ultimate Leadership with John Townsend, Henry Cloud. It was an interesting thing where they basically crack your head open and your heart open on a rock, and they in a small group context.
That sounds great.
I mean, it's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome. But for me, as an introvert, it was an interesting thing. And to walk into a group of men and women, adult men and women, and expect to share some of the things that were shared. Yeah. And that they were shared, and it went well. It changed my perspective on this. But I wonder in middle school, like, just trying to get boys to talk about things boys need to talk about, girls need to talk about what girls need to talk about. They're so focused on what does this other person think of me at that age. That's just a developmental reality. I wonder if there's just a window where whatever you can do, make it gender specific, and then that window may, later
Absolutely.
on.
I mean, I don't think that's what this is about. I don't think this is about. I think we all kind of intuitively get there's an age where we need to pair up genders because the puberty's coming into play, and all that kind of stuff. I think where I imagine a lot of women are feeling the tension is you're like a youth pastor, and you got volunteers that are male, or you're up there speaking to not just females, you're speaking to males as well. And I'll be honest, like if I was I would say different things to the genders about this issue. To women, I would say, and I would just had this conversation with an amazing up and coming female leader just the other day. She came in my office and she started to describe her personality. And if you've done any of those personality tests, you may recognize some of these terms. She was a red on the color test. She was an 8 on the Enneagram, or a 7-wing 8 or something like that. She was a motivator on the right path test.
Right.
And then she told me these things because I asked. I said, hey, tell me about yourself. What's your personality? What's this? And she then spent 10 to 15 minutes apologizing to me for that personality. Saying, well, but it doesn't mean that I do this, and I'm not too opinionated here, and I just want you to know that it doesn't mean this. And eventually I was like, hey, just hold on. Can I interrupt you? Stop apologizing to me for how
you're wired.
You're wired.
Yeah.
And that would be, man, if I could, in 2 words, say what I would say to women leaders, I would say stop apologizing for being great, for being strong, for being smart, for being bold, for having a personality that's a leader kind of personality. It's really unfortunate in a lot of our organizations, and especially in our quote industry in the church world or the nonprofit world, that people with those personalities who are men, they get called leaders. Women with those personalities, they get called
something else.
Ball busters and another B word that I don't think we can say on this podcast. And women out there who listen to this, that's true.
Jamie.
I was hired by, I was in education, in middle school education. Up north, it was half men, half women on staff. When I moved to Georgia, it was all women and like 2 men. And in fact, the kids called me like their first boy teacher is how they describe it. Super fun stuff. But I was hired by a strong woman leader who was hired to come clean up schools. That's what she did. But her nickname was Bloody Mary.
Oh.
And I just remember thinking, wow, if that was a man, his nickname would be like the Liberator or something. You know what I mean? But Mary gets Bloody Mary, because it was interesting. Strong leader. She was great, made decisions, made hard decisions. You know, sometimes it was like, do you have a heart?
Yeah.
But those are some of the decisions you need to make in those situations. That's why she's hired. She comes in for 2 or 3 years, cleans up, hands it off. Anyway, I don't know that that's necessarily what we're talking about either, but it's such an interesting
Well, it brings up an interesting point, though, that there's an expectation of what women in leadership look like and what that personality type should be.
And if we're preparing girls to be those leaders.
And if we're preparing girls to be those leaders. And that I've seen that carry over a lot onto student ministry stages. Like I've just noticed women get handed certain topics over and over and over. And I've started to pray when I see a woman walk on stage that she's not talking about identity and self-image. Right. Just talk about something.
She's a woman. Let's get her to talk about identity.
Yes. And it might not even be her thing. That might not be the topic that she's the best.
But that's when we have women speak.
But that's when we have women speak.
That is
interesting. And Jamie, I think you brought up an interesting point too. You had this woman come into your office and describe herself and then apologize. You probably haven't had men come into your office with those characteristics and apologize for it. But there's something to be said, not just for the environment that the women are working in, whether they feel that kind of pressure from leadership or not, but maybe a lot of women aren't necessarily comfortable with that themselves being that way yet. And so there's something to be said for becoming more self-aware of how you're wired and embracing that individually and not just in your kind of work environment and expecting other people to validate you.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar, I would imagine, to that Dove commercial we've all seen.
Oh, yeah.
Where they ask women, hey, and even some older guys, throw like a girl, run like a girl, and so on. And they do the lamest, most unathletic motions. But then they ask little girls, and they ran hard, and they threw hard, and they punched hard, fiercely and with, skill. And I mean, there's going to be a little bit of, I don't know if this is the right word, but a little bit of PTSD that continues to linger, especially in women our age who are trying to lead, who've got this lingering idea that here's what a woman looks like in leadership, if they even belong there at all.
Right.
And that's unfortunate.
But it's interesting to think of if they, as a leader, begin to change what it could mean for the generation behind them.
Right.
If they begin to embrace.
We're going to need pioneers.
So no one teaches women shouldn't be in leadership. No one, I mean, some people probably do, actually. Actually, people do teach that. But back to my point, those of us who are listening to this podcast thinking, how do we encourage women to be leaders? We accidentally do it. We do it subconsciously. We do it through the examples that we're used to. What are those, and how do we
That's a good question.
as we're preparing to speak, as we're writing small group questions, as we're figuring out who's going to speak on what topics, what are some of the things to you two ladies that we need to be thinking through. So I'll just give you throw an example. Like I was a science teacher. And from the beginning, for whatever reason, and I honestly don't know, I was super sensitive to the fact that 20 years ago when I was a science teacher, that there were, I think it was because my girlfriend in college was in the engineering program and she was one of the few, and the dean of students told her, this isn't really for you.
Oh my
Wow.
You know, like you're probably going to find a husband in there. And it was, you know, it was this interesting message. Yeah, our alma mater. That's right. And it's not that way anymore from what I understand.
That's good.
But I think that's why I was so sensitive to it.
Yeah.
So I was, as a science teacher, I on purpose would make sure that girls who were good at science and math knew that somebody thought they were good at science and math.
Yeah.
Those are the sorts of things I think I'm just talking about.
Yeah, I think the point of even just having a woman on stage occasionally, you recognize yourself. I mean, there's something to be said for seeing yourself up there.
Yeah.
And thinking, oh, maybe I could do that too, since she's doing it.
I was so proud of our church recently because we were doing a dating series, because it's the time of year when everyone in America does a dating series with their high schoolers, and a girl was on stage.
Valentine's Day before prom, right?
That's right. Between Valentine's Day and prom, you've got to do it. A girl's on stage and she's not teaching a girly topic. She's teaching like any other dating topic to both guys and girls.
Yeah.
There was no question of, will this advice apply to you boys? No, she just taught like anybody else would teach. And I was silently trying to get myself under control to not cheer in the back of the room. Like, yes, you can talk about that too.
Yeah, I think to men, as far as changing this culture,
Yeah.
of like, I think definitely step one would be looking in the mirror, and does the Holy Spirit need to do some work in me to leave behind some stereotypes that women can't lead, or that they're not logical, or they do things like a girl, you know, like we were saying. That's definitely a question worth asking.
Yeah.
Even if you're like, you know, I'm not trying to be that way, but maybe on accident,
Right.
I've just made some assumptions that silently stand in the way of some of the amazing women that God's brought around me going forward. I think the other is to develop and encourage young talent like we would if they were male. So like if I see a young leader or a communicator who's a dude, obviously I'm trying to figure out how to help him either preach or lead, but being aggressive about that with with women, young women who are talented, because they may have already disqualified themselves. They may not be as vocal about it, saying, hey, I want to try preaching. Maybe they thought, I can't preach. Or maybe they thought, oh, I guess I'm not supposed to lead, because they're always dudes. So being maybe a little more aggressive at trying to call that out of some young women, like, hey, I see this in you. I want you to try it.
Yeah.
Even if they go, well, I don't know. Well, maybe they've been believing for 10 years now that that's not for them, simply because they're a girl. And one thing I can do is try to call that out, to give opportunity, and lean really hard into developing. You know, sorry, I'm talking probably too much here, but
it's great.
A lot of us who are young men in ministry or even in college ministry, people are constantly, we're trying to train me to be a leader and to be a communicator. And I don't think that that's been happening in, like, there's no, what I'm trying to say is farm league for women. And so there's a lot of women trying to get into it in their 20s and their 30s, and they don't have that investment up to this point that a lot of the men have. So they talk once on stage, and then a bunch of dudes are like, I mean, it was okay. And then there was another opportunity. It's like, no, this literally was their first time. And it wasn't even like their first time on our stage. It was probably their first time communicating. These other guys whom it was their first time did it 7 or 8 other times in FCA, in Campus Crusade, and so on and so forth. Realizing that and being willing to go, no, I'm gonna start a process with you to give you a chance to fan this talent into flame. I think that's something that men in leadership can do better. Yeah.
And to think through, for your kids, who are the voices that people are listening to? Because, you know, the beautiful thing about family ministry is it's a conveyor belt. So, like, we can, within a generation, scrub that out. That little girls don't think they can speak because they see women speak all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or lead or do whatever. You know, we used to do 6th grade boot camp, and we ran into the issue that, you know, who do we want to speak? And we would just say, who are your favorites to speak? And we were like, they're all men. You know, and it's like, well, I want at least one woman on stage for a first impression for new 6th graders. So who's it going to be? And so we would, you know, and again, this was 15 years ago, I guess, which isn't that long. So it's not an excuse. I'm just saying that when you just ask people who are your favorite communicators, I bet you they will list 95% men, you know. Just having a policy, like at every camp, at least one time, this crowd should see, boys and girls should see a woman speaking, I think these are the sort of decisions that we've got to make.
Because it could be church is the only place where that's not happening. I mean, it's not like culture is not putting women up in positions to speak or lead.
Right.
And so it's really a matter of the church keeping pace with what they're already seeing outside of church.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that was something that was always so puzzling to me. I remember at a church where I was volunteering, I had the opportunity to speak. I was really excited about it. And one of the first things that I was asked was, well, what are you going to do to keep the attention of the boys? And I thought for a second, and I thought, well, at the time I was a high school teacher. I'm going to do the same thing I do every day of my life when I'm teaching verb conjugation. And this is way more interesting than verb conjugation. But it was just an assumption that wasn't possible, where the school system doesn't struggle with this. There's no assumption that women can't teach boys in the school system or men can't teach girls. It's just...
And the amount of times I've sat in the back of the room and thought, for a male communicator, that's a total male example. You haven't thought through your audience. Yeah. You know what I mean?
That's interesting.
I mean, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And that was part of my process, is I would figure out my tension as a middle school boy, why I care about this. And then I'd go down to my wife and go, here's the tension I've come up with. Does this connect with a middle school girl's brain, or do I need another example? Like, that was just part of my process because half the room's girls, actually more than half.
And I think if you're a woman on the stage, I think you feel that pressure of you're needing to work harder to connect, because there's a higher.
I agree. I'm just saying, I think guys should.
Yeah, they should, but I don't think they feel like they need to.
No,
and Crystal, we were talking a little bit earlier about there is a level of pressure on girls, and someone gets up on the stage and you're sitting in the audience and you're going, please don't screw this up. Like, we're cheering for you, but like, if this doesn't go well, this might not happen again for anybody, for another woman. So there's that kind of adds an element of complexity, I think, too. Pressure.
There is an added level of pressure, but Chef, I think you brought up something that all of us know, which is we can't teach from a perspective that we don't have. So I've never been a middle school boy, but I've also never been from the suburbs, and I've never grown up in a city. And there's a lot of different perspectives that we have to think through. So maybe one of the best things that we can begin to do. I love that you asked your wife.
Yeah.
What were the tensions that you felt? Yeah. To some degree, we all work with this company called Orange that creates youth ministry resources. And every time there is a message that we write, it goes through all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds to say, does this still land with you?
Yeah.
Right.
And then I think when you teach those at the individual churches, you almost have to go through that process again of, does this still land with all of us?
The thing, if I could say two pieces of advice just to anyone trying to lead people of the opposite gender, one's already been said, but that first would be to be a student. So, and this is if you're a man, if you're a woman in leadership, you've got to be a student of the other gender. Chef was just talking about this. But it doesn't just apply to messaging. It applies to if you're a host in front of there. Someone says, hey, will you host an event? All right, well, who's the guy that you talk to go, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Do you think that's funny? If you are writing curriculum, if you're making small group questions, if you are doing a leader training, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You need to have somebody who helps you be a good student of that gender. It can be your spouse, wife, boyfriend, friend, roommate, someone on staff, so on and so forth. So, so number one, be a student. Be a student of the other gender. Period. That seems obvious, but I think it's easy in the pace of ministry just to go, I got it. And I'll just think of it the best I can. No. Have your person that helps you be a student. The second thing, if I was a leader or if I was speaking to a young leader, I would tell them, you've got to give the other gender not just your time of being a student. You need to give them a person. And here's what I mean. Chef, you kind of mentioned this with speaking. As a leader, you got to give your girls in the room a girl on the stage. I think you've got to do that. And you've absolutely got to do that, be it a host, a communicator, at an event, that kind of thing. But also, give them a girl in the creative process. That's a gift you can give the women in your ministry if you're a man. And vice versa. If you're a woman leading a student ministry, give your boys a guy in the creative process to go like, hold on a second. That sounds really girly. Can I suggest an alternative or an add-on or a plus one? You're giving them a gift of representation. And also in the trenches. Like if you're a groups director, some of you are leading volunteers and you might be a woman and there's a lot of men in there. Well, you know what? What if you recruited one of them to be a coach? Because some of the men are going to have a moment where they're like, I kind of just want to talk to another man about this particular issue. Great. I gave you a person and this is a coach to have. So
that's where we found our ministries took off. When I could have a separate guys and groups director who's dealing with the guys and groups, small group leaders who are dealing with the guys and girls groups. As the campuses grew, when that happened, that was the trigger for explosive effectiveness, explosive growth. I don't know why, But I think it's to what you're saying. And if you're a small church like I grew up in, where, it's 7 of us with my dad, I think what you said, Jamie, is exactly right. Like, find a volunteer, then find someone, and my dad was a volunteer. But the idea of giving them the gift of having, the same gender to go to for something, a different gender within the creative context of how things were led. I mean, my dad did a great job with what he knew, but it was very based on his experience, his background, his gender, to think beyond that. I mean, one of the filters we think through a ton here is small church and large church. Like, those are different, like you were talking about, urban, suburban, all that sort of stuff, male and female, all of those things should be part of your matrix as you're trying to figure out what to do.
This conversation, honestly, isn't too far away from the race conversation.
Yeah.
Of saying, you should be having conversations with people of a different race than you. You should be thinking from that, asking great questions.
I remember Gerald, for instance, and a little bit embarrassing is I used to use the term drive-by leadership all the time as kind of a joke about, leaders who don't pay attention and then swing in and, change all the plans and basically deflate anybody who worked for them, those sorts of things. Then I had Gerald Fadiomi, who's been on a few episodes with us, black guy, grew up more inner city, much more inner city than me, from the country. And he just stopped me one day and said, that's not funny to me. Like, I was like, because he's seen it, That's a filter that I need to, if I'm going to be an effective communicator to a diverse audience, to a large audience, it's just one of my responsibilities.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting you bring up how we speak, because just like that example there with race, I, early on in my communicating, realized I was doing the same thing with gender. And it would be, I do sound effects and sometimes I do voices. And my voice for a girl, I didn't even realize it, think about it, but I had a voice for a girl.
Yeah.
And eventually a girl leader was like, hey, you do that voice for a girl, and it's kind of like dumb. I mean, like, it's funny, but it's like, it doesn't make girls look good.
Can you just give us an example, just really quick?
And you're like, oh my gosh, and like, that kind of thing, And someone was nicely pointing out, like, look, that's funny. I know you have a good heart, but like, it can communicate that's how you view girls, which it isn't how I view girls.
Right.
I was just trying to be funny. Or in my examples, and now I'm getting into communicating here, but in my examples in communicating, I would often, sometimes because of lack of preparation of that particular section, like either in the setup.
Often because of
Sunday's
in my experience with my own communication.
Okay.
I'm not making any judgments on Jamie. He's one of the best communicators I know.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. But anyway, in the setup, I'm giving some examples of, hey, maybe you've done this, and hey, maybe you've done that. Or in the application, hey, maybe you need to go and do this. I would kind of default to some stereotypes. Yeah. And they weren't like malicious stereotypes, but nevertheless, it was like, well, girls, maybe for you it's this. And it's like, well, of course you said that, That's the one you kind of say every time.
Right.
Like, maybe you have some hurt feelings, and guys, maybe it's in when you're success. And, it wasn't those. I can't even remember what it would be, but realizing that my language, I had a blind spot in my language. And someone else had to point that out. And I was like, oh.
Well, this is this is why communicating so hard, and why 80% of it, 90% of it is the prep. Because those are the differences that are going to separate you from a great communicator, who can talk to a diverse audience versus somebody who people just enjoy listening to.
Because off the cuff, you're going to default to what you know.
You're going to, And to take the time and go to ask yourself on purpose, what am I going to default to? And how do I keep from defaulting to it? I mean, I think that's just next level leadership.
I love what you said, Jamie, about inviting somebody into the creative process, because I think there's a lot of benefit that's obviously visual for having someone on the stage that you can see, but inviting someone in on the back end or the front end before you're even having someone on stage, I think there's a lot of value in that too that I wouldn't normally think through. I think that's really good. Okay, so this has been, for the most part, kind of higher level when it comes to leading students of the opposite gender. What are some practical ways that we can just make this more applicable to leaders?
In the last, 8 months? I mean, since summer camp, Crystal spoke at summer camp, and that was kind of a big one for you.
It was a big moment for me. It was a much larger audience than I'd ever spoken to.
So I think on the practical side, can you talk about how you felt, how it came about, maybe what you did in response to all of those questions as a female speaker who's thinking about these things?
Sure. So as a female who had spoken, I would not have called myself a female speaker.
Who has?
I would now.
And we were preparing for high school camp, which is our annual summer camp. And It was really exciting. We had one of the best female communicators in the country set to be there, and she couldn't make it.
Yeah.
And so I started pushing for another one of just this woman that I just so respect. I think she's an amazing communicator to make it, and she couldn't make it. And so the question came up of would I be willing to speak? And the answer was no. And I could go around the room going, I told you no, and I told you no, and I told you no. And the reason was I didn't, like Jamie had mentioned earlier, I just didn't have the reps in to step onto a stage of that size. It had been some time, and I'd spoken at some smaller FCAs, but even that sort of infrequently. And you guys, to say I was scared is the biggest understatement. I mean, there was a lot of sleep loss because I didn't want to botch it, not just for my own, ego or whatever. I didn't want to botch it because there were, 2,000 kids in the room. And if I lost half of them, then that was their summer camp experience.
Right.
That was
a lot on the line.
That was a lot on the line. And I was so nervous about it. And so, and of course, echoing in my mind was the question I'd been asked years ago, which was, how do you keep the boys' attention? And I would say my stunning good looks would be the first place to start. But in case that wasn't it, as I started working on the message, I was lucky to have an incredible support system of guys to bounce ideas off of. And so 2 of them are sitting here at the table. They both saw first drafts and sent such great feedback, so helpful. Stuart Hall was one of the ones I sent to. Ben Crawshaw was one of the ones I sent it to. And there were, just guy after guy after guy. I sent them this talk and said, what do you think? What doesn't land? And, they would circle words or phrases and send it back and say, I would tweak that. Or I would say that. Some would send it back with voice recordings and say, I would say it in this tone of voice. Wow. Which was so helpful. So helpful. And so then we get to the big day, and, I remember what eating was like at that point, but I hadn't eaten in days because I was so nervous. And
your parents were there.
My parents showed up. Like, that's what a big deal was. No, it's fine. Like, 2,000 kids, adults in our industry that I barely know, and then every colleague I have, we're all at the same place. And my mom and dad showed up. So I was so nervous. And not only did I have all of those people who had sort of helped prepare the talk, and then Chef came backstage and said, hey, can I pray for you? And I said, yes, please. And also, he said, you're going to kill it. And that was the last words I heard before I walked on stage was, you're going to kill it.
And then you killed it.
And well, that is very kind. But from the stage where I was most nervous, I did not see my parents. I saw Jamie sitting in the front row, nodding. and then apparently he was texting through the whole thing because I got this barrage of text messages afterwards.
That's amazing.
And then came up afterwards and gave me just the most helpful feedback, but also just the kindest, most encouraging. I will never forget those conversations because as a woman, sometimes it does feel like there's a lot of pressure and you get one shot to make it great. And I felt like I didn't step on that stage alone. I stepped on a stage with a team of a whole bunch of men who had paved the way and said, you're going to kill it. And here's how you do it. So
that's awesome.
Can I please not cry on a podcast about being a woman?
No, come on.
Well, here's the thing. I just want to point out.
If that helps.
It's emotional. I just want to point out, though, it's not like Crystal had special help. That's the help that I've had all along the way in my career.
That's a good point.
That's a
Great
really
people
good
coming
point.
alongside me. People believed in me. People that I could share my talks with. People that when I screwed up, they were like, "It's okay. I believe in you. You're going to do better next time. In fact, here's 2 or 3 things I can help." Which I didn't even do that with you. I'm just saying, but that's been going.
Back and pray with.
Yes, you did.
Because everybody prays with me before I go on a camp. I mean, it's, somebody does.
So you didn't get special attention or help. You just got what you deserved, which was to have your family and friends around you, and you did exactly what God had called you to do, and you delivered that message really, really, really well.
It was so good.
Yeah,
it was so good. I remember my text message stream to people was like, this message has gone beyond speaking to just pure leadership.
That's awesome.
I mean, when she was having people stand up, I thought, my gracious, this was
awesome.
It was the best camp talk I've heard in
that was
years.
Really,
it was
really
awesome.
kind.
Very good.
I'm actually scrolling through Jamie's text messages. But this is what I'm talking about. Before the talk ever happened, number 1, intro. definitely do the dog illustration. You don't want to sound like a teacher, but you won't. It'll be fine. Number 2, the tension. I'd move away from you don't know what you're doing. I think you'll get pushed back. You can keep most of it. Here's the words I would use instead. It's that kind of practical help. And I could go down. There is a stream of text messages.
So it seems like
helpful.
It's both. I mean, it's Crystal, your willingness to invite people into the process, because when you create content there, it's very personal. It feels very personal to let someone in and to invite them to kind of tear it apart a little bit. But if you want to improve and be the most effective in reaching the audience that you have, there needs to be a level of vulnerability in inviting someone in, but then also having the people around you who are willing to do that and not just correct or guide, but just be encouragers and cheerleaders of you along the way as well.
And if you're scared enough, you'll invite them.
That's awesome. Any other examples of what practical ways we can lead students of the opposite gender?
Well, I just think even just the pronouns you use are simple ones.
Yeah.
You know, he or she, or sometimes just drop a she.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to leadership or, you know, something like that. So,
Yeah.
That's good.
Those are nice. Someone told me one time randomly after a talk, they're like, I did that. I only said she. Like, I only used the girl example. When usually I might go a guy and then add on a girl, I just said she or whatever. And someone's like, hey, I noticed you did that. Thanks. That was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay just to do a girl example.
Right.
Right.
Because it's definitely okay just to do a guy example sometimes. Well, it's not, but you know what I mean.
But it just
You
goes
feel
to
like it
show
is.
people are paying attention.
Right.
And those little things stand out and matter.
I do just want to throw out one thing I think we all agree. I just don't want us to lose sight of. As important as it is to talk about these very tangible and intentional things that we can do to lead students of the opposite gender, regardless of what gender we are, don't forget that the most compelling thing about you in the end of the day isn't going to be your gender or how well you can reach across the aisle to the other gender. It's going to be that you love Jesus and you love students. All students want to follow someone who loves them and who loves Jesus. And it goes the same for communicating. It's like someone who puts in the hard work in their craft, whether you get it perfectly or not. Yeah, you got to be intentional. You need to have people speaking in your process. But if you get up there and you've worked really hard, you love the Word of God and you love students, that's the thing. Like, so my biggest, I mean, it's, female communicators have asked me before, and one of the things I just say is go love Jesus with everything you got and go be as great as you can. And you know what? You're going to be phenomenal. God's going to, and if you don't say the perfect joke for a guy or, you know, you say something like, oh, that was kind of girly. Okay, I do that too. Yeah. But you know what? In the end of the day, I do just lean on the fact that, like, I really do freaking love every student that I talk to.
Yeah.
And I'm trying the best I can to love Jesus. I think in the end of the day, like, just go chase that, especially I would say that to a woman leader or communicator. Go chase that, and you'll be the real deal, and you'll be undeniable. Yeah. Even when people don't give you the time of day or they discount you, you'll still be undeniable. I mean, I think there are a lot of biblical examples of that too, of just people that like probably shouldn't have been in the position that they were, but God was with them, and they were fully surrendered to Him, and it was kind of undeniable. Yeah, you know. Yeah. And it was more compelling than anyone's skepticism. Yeah. So.
That's good. Okay, so as we get closer to kind of wrapping up, what are some ways that we can lead offstage students of the opposite gender?
I would say no matter what size church you're in, no individual leader should be the only leader in any student's life. Okay. No matter if you've got a group of 5 or a group of 5,000 kids, there needs to be multiple leaders involved. There need to be multiple genders. And that's why I'm such a big fan of small groups ministry. Yeah. So that one person isn't carrying the weight of ministering to every kid. Right. But you've got guys to lead guys, girls to lead girls, and guys and girls that both can look up to. I think that's really important to have lots of leaders involved.
That's good.
I think, being a student ministry that's centered around yourself, Crystal, I totally agree. That is unintentionally probably sexist because you're going to do a better job loving on mostly the gender that you identify with. And you got to give them a person, give them someone of their gender, and give them a small group leader. And because, by the way, also, you shouldn't be having one-on-ones with people of the opposite gender. In today's culture and world, with everything that's going on, and more and more cases, like the 700 abused, kids thing that just came out within the Baptist church. I mean, we just have got to have guardrails in place. And so I don't think the answer is to go start having one-on-ones if you're a guy with a bunch of girls in your student ministry. That is not the solution.
Please don't.
Nor the opposite way around. So be strategic.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through, I don't know how to apply this, but I'm just thinking, but if a girl does come to you and you are the person they've trusted, you know, so be wise about it, you know, like where you'd sit down and talk. But at the same time, when a kid has chosen someone to tell something to, and it might not be appropriate, or you may need to be wise about it, but don't just, again, it's balance.
Well, I bet you've done this before where, yes, absolutely. I have girls come to me and they'll share, this doesn't happen all the time, but they'll share something very hurtful, personal, whatever.
Right.
And I've got to be ready to lean in, be there for her. But the thing that I think we've all probably done before is, especially as a pastor, I've gone hey, thank you so much for sharing this. Here's some of my thoughts. But before we're done, does your small group leader know about this?
Yes.
Do I have your permission to get them involved? Because you know what? I think your small group leader is going to have a perspective and maybe be able to talk to you about this in a way that I can't. I'm going to do my best, and I'm here for you. I'm in till the end. But I think she's going to be able to bring something.
Guide you. Well, it's just, I'm really thinking of that moment you're panicking. There's a, oh my gosh, no matter who it is, maybe a multiplier, maybe just addition to it. It's especially if you're high school, it's an opposite gender. You've got to be super wise, but you also have to honor the fact that you might be the first person and maybe only person ever that they're going to trust enough to say something. So how do I, one, make sure it gets out, and two, pass it on in a responsible manner, I just want to be super careful because it's ministry, and it's messy. It's some of the things we have to do. So, but be smart. Please be smart.
One of my favorite jobs as a volunteer at the last church I was in was a guy was leading that ministry, but I was a single girl. I didn't have, kids to get home to. And so his request to me was, can you just make sure that you are always one of the last people in the room? And the reason for that is if a kid walks up to me in the middle of the hallway and starts to have a personal conversation, can you just exist in our general space? Just don't leave. Don't leave me alone with them. Just stick around so that there's never a time where there's just a girl and me in the building.
That's a great practical tip.
And I loved that role. And it was great just to be around and, sometimes step into the conversations and sometimes just be another human being in this space.
Another
set of eyes
in the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
That's good.
That is good.
So good.
I wonder if off stage maybe this is a more of a man thing, but thinking about even just the way you speak and joke in public, there is a way that with guys, usually the way you talk with the guys, but then there's a way you talk with, women present. And as a student pastor, I'm careful to not accidentally create a culture around me where girls don't feel welcome or they feel like he just really wants to hang with guys. I wonder if that's something to think about. I don't know.
I think that's actually true for both genders.
Yeah.
That sometimes girls in a group can talk about men or talk about boys like they're stupid. And we have to be careful as women in leadership to not talk about men like there was even for a while, I don't know if you noticed this, there was a sitcom culture for about 10 years where the guy in every sitcom was just an idiot.
Especially the dad.
The dad. It was always the dad. He was always an idiot. And it became okay among women to just talk about men like that.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is true when it's women sitting around. We don't want to create a culture where we assume every guy in the room is not as smart.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It goes both ways.
I think in closing, I just feel like it's prep. And part of your preparation process has to be running through the different filters of who I'm talking to. And those include, they're not just all sports kids, there's some band kids and there's some drama kids. There's guys, there's girls, there's, different genders, obviously genders, different races, things to think through as you're prepping. So just don't miss that part of your preparation.
Shep, that was great. And guys, I want to thank all three of you for being here and contributing to this conversation. This was super insightful and helpful. And I have to be honest, there was more here than I thought there was going to be. So that was awesome. So if you have a friend who came to mind as you were listening to this episode who you thought might benefit from this conversation, you can send them to our website, rethinkingym.org. And until next time, thank you for listening.